Issa? Yes. Issa Galloway.
Issa Galloway defines the mission.
Welcome to Ramadan Recap, where in about 10 minutes we break down the most impactful news stories of the day so you don't have to. A quick note about today's episode is the second half is going to be dedicated to a really important story coming out of Houston, Texas, the 26th annual Grand Iftar. And that story deals with the entire reason I created this channel, dealing with everything from your freedoms to identity politics to civic participation. The first story, however, is incredibly surprising because it is an unexpected move from the Trump administration on foreign policy. Apparently, the Trump administration is threatening Russia with new sanctions to push the peace deal forward. Now, something to remember anytime you hear about U.S. sanctions against Russia is the Russian economy has time and again proven to be very resilient, with the war machine continuing to ramp up its production in spite of whatever sanctions regimes are placed on the nation of Russia. This leads me to the conclusion that this is likely an attempt by the president to kind of control the news cycle or change the narrative, as recently a lot of stories have come out basically accusing the president of being too close to Putin or being a Russian asset. Now, the next story is probably the most impactful for today and the most important for you to keep your eye focused on is because it is an escalation on the attack on free speech and our First Amendment. What is happening here is Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently reported today, in fact, that we will be revoking the visas and or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so they can be deported. Now, this is after the Department of Homeland Security has detained a Columbia University student at the Columbia encampment. When his lawyers were working on this case, it came out that he was not on a student visa, but rather a permanent resident and a green card holder. And this has expanded who the Trump administration is targeting and what they will revoke in order to deport people. The next story is also involving Secretary of State Marco Rubio, but including Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy, both of whom openly clashed with Elon Musk during a cabinet meeting recently, demonstrating deep fractures and divisions in the MAGA movement. Rubio, Duffy, and Musk reportedly all accused each other of lying, and to me the most telling exchange is when Mr. Duffy said, "Young staff of Mr. Musk's team have been trying to lay off air traffic controllers. What am I supposed to do?" he exclaimed. "I have multiple plane crashes to deal with now, and your people want me to fire air traffic controllers." Just let that sit for a second. Trump apparently had been trying to clarify as a result of this meeting that Musk cannot directly fire federal employees, but it does seem he's trying to have it both ways because in recent cabinet meetings, he also told his cabinet to get on board with Doge and Musk or quote unquote, get out. Now, the next story is incredibly important. It's reported by Dropsite News, and the nation of Qatar has submitted a demand to the UN basically asking to place all Israeli nuclear facilities under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, and for Israel to disarm its nuclear weapons by joining the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, essentially asking that Israel become a non-nuclear state. Now, there is no way that this is going to happen, but the story is important because, at least in public and in the media, it's showing that Arab states continue to grow a spine. The next story I need to translate for you. It already is in the English version. And this is from Ynet. And if you remember in the last episode, I reported that for the first time, at least in public, an administration admitted to having direct negotiations with a U.S. designated terror organization. Well, the talks between the Trump admin and Hamas continue, which seems to be incredibly upsetting the Israelis because Trump's team member, Mr. Bollier, insisted on CNN in front of Jake Tapper that the United States is, quote, "we're not an agent of Israel," implying that the U.S. is going to pursue its own foreign policy interest instead of that of our client state. He said that not only that, but Hamas has offered to release all of the hostages in return for a 5 to 10 year ceasefire. And Bollier continued that they would not rule out this kind of deal or that they would not rule out future negotiations directly with Hamas. Now, what's so interesting about this is it seems to have cut Netanyahu out of the negotiation process, similar to how they have cut Zelensky out of the peace deals with Russia. Now, the next story is also incredibly important because it is talking about the genocide happening and that the nation of Israel has cut off all power to Gaza. This is exactly the kind of thing, as Mehdi Hassan of Zateo News points out, that the International Criminal Court of Justice has specifically warned against in the genocide case against Israel. speaking of genocide and actions that are symbolic, the Houston Muslim community, at least according to the Houston Chronicle, is split on Mayor Whitmer's involvement in an annual dinner, the 26th annual Grand Iftar. Now, this comes after the 25th one last year also had a controversy surrounding it. Before I go further, though, I have to make some very important disclosures. First and foremost, I was the founding executive director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations Houston, or CARE Houston, when that chapter was incorporated in 2002. The second one is that I was the first ever executive director of the Islamic Society of Greater Houston, brought in to do outreach and public relations for that organization. And in both cases, I have the experience to say that the Houston Muslim community at large and ISGH in particular are just kind of terrible at doing civics and doing message strategy or public relations. Now, I don't say that with any kind of glee. I say that to emphasize that we don't learn lessons that we should have learned many times over. Now, this is not the first time that the Grand Iftar had a controversy. Last year, when the mayor of Houston refused to support or even allow for a ceasefire resolution, the Islamic Society of Greater Houston and CARE Houston both boycotted the Grand Iftar, and that led to protests in and outside of the event last year. Now, this is being filmed while that iftar is happening, so likely there are repeat protests happening. Now, what I say about us not learning lessons, again, I don't say that with any kind of glee or an I told you so type of attitude, but what I'm trying to get us to understand is that we have multiple audiences and unintended messaging happens all the time. Now, I want to harken back to an event that happened in Katy, Texas, a suburb of Houston, and it was quite famous because it got onto The Daily Show as an example called Loathe Thy Neighbor, link in the description. Now, what this was on Baker Road, a gentleman named Chris Baker owned a business property right next to a property that a community bought in order to build a mosque. At first, relations were cordial, and then when the mosque committee had saw that there was an agricultural exemption on the land, they wanted to remove it because that had electric fencing, which posed a problem or a danger to youth that could be running around and playing on their property. This, of course, hit the bottom line and tax exemptions that Chris Baker had and caused the issue and conflict to happen, where Chris Baker eventually came up with what he thought was a great idea of protesting the mosque by having pig races every Friday night outside right next door on the line separating the two properties, Chris Baker's property and the new mosque. He put up a giant mural that had an Israeli flag on one side and an American flag on the other, and then would conduct these pig races through a makeshift circuit or track. Now, what I had suggested to the mosque at the time was something quite the opposite of what they wanted to do, and this is the first problem that the Muslim community at large, but particularly in Houston, tends to always kind of fight the fight that's given to them out of emotional thinking and out of frustration. What they did was they kind of counter protested back and called everything Islamophobia. My suggestion at the time was instead of fighting them on the turf and the messaging that they established, that they should have set up halal barbecue and offered sausages, hot dogs, and whatnot to the people attending the pig races for free to defuse the situation, and then kind of call out how ridiculous it is to say that somehow having pigs was an offense to Muslims. We just don't eat them. That's not the issue. And kind of shine a light on the bigotry of the person and then take over the messaging to say, hey, this is all kind of fake protest because it all started when the agricultural exemption got threatened from Mr. Baker. Now, over time, I think the neighbors have reconciled and have good relations, but imagine how much faster that could have happened if we were thinking outside the box and considering the multiple audiences we have. This is why I say that, again, the Houston Muslim community in general, and ISGH in particular, is just not good at message strategy or civics. And this is because this is the second year in a row where they're sort of dealing with the same issue, but the story has evolved. Now, before I go further, I do want to say there is some good news in this situation. One, first and foremost, that the Muslim community at large is really frustrated with the capitulation or the involvement of ISGH with this iftar, which shows that the community's heart is really in the right place. The other piece of good news is that even though Houston is the fourth largest city in America and the most diverse city in America, it is not really a major news market, meaning that most of the time, unless the story is incredibly sensational, things like this don't make national news in a way that will impact the American Muslim community at large. So we get to learn lessons from this without having to suffer major setbacks against the Muslim community and the mistakes being made. Now, here's the first thing. We don't learn to pick our battles or we don't often examine kind of the field of battle or the messaging that we often react to. And that, again, I think comes from emotional thinking, of being a community that is often always under stress and threat, and not having the ability to step back and think, what are unintended messages of our actions? Last year, I think the boycotts were incredibly effective and the right move, because it was all about a ceasefire resolution and the mayor shutting it down for no good reason. This year, however, the mayor's team laid a PR trap, which I had mentioned in the last episode of this program. But basically, the mayor's advisor, Mary Benton, laid the trap using what's called the false dichotomy, which is a logical fallacy, saying that there are only two scenarios when there, in fact, are more. Her messaging basically said that you're either a Hamas supporter or you support Israel. Now, the reason this is so important is we're seeing the Trump administration now use any excuse to call someone a Hamas supporter to go after them and shut down free speech, where the dichotomy that Mary Benton laid out to defend the mayor is basically playing directly into that and endangering the Houston Muslim community and their right to protest and free speech. The reason this is such a big deal is because we accepted that fight on their terms and on the messaging that she has laid out. The problem with that is that if you are purporting to support a ceasefire, you're basically pro peace. And you have groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. You also have groups like Veterans for Peace that have been active supporting the ceasefire, and they're definitely not pro Hamas. So this false dichotomy is a very dangerous thing that can happen to the community. One of the best possible responses is to have those non-Muslim groups in front and center as part of the voices protesting. Another thing is to think about that this reinforces the false message, the false understanding that this is a conflict of centuries gone over and over just between Muslims and Jews, with either mutual hatred or specifically the narrative that Muslims have a problem with Jews, which I've often rebuked on this channel, talking about the long history of Muslims supporting, protecting, and working with the Jewish community against aggression, either against both communities or giving them safe haven from the Holocaust. Now, the way the mayor portrayed all of this is to say that, if you are, and this all stemmed from an invite-only event for what the media reports as Jewish leaders, quote unquote, where the mayor had said to prove a point to them, and this is absolutely unnecessary point that he didn't have to state, that he said, when your enemies challenged me to adopt a ceasefire resolution, I ignored them. So he's essentially saying that anyone who is pro-ceasefire is an enemy to the Jewish community. And this is a terrible thing because, number one, it favoritizes one community over others. But more importantly, the insinuation that peace activists are the enemy of quote-unquote Jewish leaders really plays, in fact, into an anti-Semitic trope. It implies that those leaders have an agenda that is anti-peace. It also implies that those leaders' allegiances are to a foreign nation above their fellow neighbors and citizens domestically, both are which anti-Semitic tropes that the mayor should have distanced himself, corrected himself when called out on it, and should be ashamed of to this day. This all brings up another question, though, and that is, where are those said Jewish leaders in rebuffing those anti-Semitic tropes? Where is the interfaith community in speaking out? Because Houston has a long, storied history of fantastic interfaith relations, especially bridging the gap between the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities and going under the slogan of the strength of our shared values. But you don't see any of those people right now trying to bridge those gaps, trying to come to resolution. And that is another message that shows that the Muslim community is not learning from these repeated infractions. So not only that, but there are some takeaways, because if you're out protesting the mayor for being against a ceasefire, like I said earlier, it does reinforce to people who aren't paying attention, who just read headlines. This headline says, Houston Muslim community split over mayor's involvement in annual dinner. Most people who see that are just going to say, oh, Muslims are mad at themselves. Who cares, right? They're not going to understand the threat to freedom of speech, the threat to the First Amendment, or the principled position that the community is taking on this. So what should have happened is that the community should have reframed the entire issue about it being a First Amendment challenge. Not only that, but because protests often are designed for us to feel better about ourselves, being that we're mostly helpless and not empowered to do anything, this protest should have been an opportunity to register people to vote, to get people on a permanent activism schedule. If they're so mad that they can come and do all the performative things to go home and then kind of high five each other and say, we stuck it to the mayor, what would be more productive is to say, we're going to remember this come the future elections. We're going to get to know everyone who supports the mayor and supports this agenda, and we're going to see who of those people are on the ballot in March and who of those people are on the ballot in November. You guys have to understand that local elections are the most impactful thing in your lives. Second is state, and then third is federal. But our community has been completely low-key, uninvolved, unless we're angry and we blow off steam at a protest and then we don't follow up. So if you think about it from the mayor's perspective on a pure realpolitik, why would the mayor take our community serious as he knows he's not going to suffer any kind of electoral or political consequence? This story actually has been put on in the media with such kid gloves that it's going to go under the rug and mostly unnoticed. So while we may feel like we've done something, at the end of the day, we're actually playing into their hands. And in fact, instead of us getting the intel on who is for our community, who's betraying our community and the cause of peace, they're actually finding out who the protesters are and potentially reporting to the federal agencies to deport people who are of vulnerable immigrant or citizen statuses. Now, the other thing is, what would be much better of a response from our community is not only registering every protester eligible to vote, but why not establish a non-governmental organization, a nonprofit that's not mosque affiliated? So the masajid, our mosques and faith institutions, don't have to be in the crosshairs of politics, because you have an administration that has openly said that they're going to go after faith administrations or faith organizations, and they're going to revoke 501c3 statuses of nonprofits with whom they disagree with. And now you have anyone who protests anything happening by Israel being considered a Hamas supporter. You can bet that these organizations are finding themselves under struggle, or at least under concerns and chill of their First Amendment rights. So instead, what should be happening is forming a 501c3 and a 501c4 kind of merged organization where the Houston Muslim community has a political action committee and a civic community that is not affiliated both with the civil rights organization or the mosques, but general membership from Houston Muslims. This protects the mosques from federal encroachment and abuse, and it also empowers the Muslim community to start becoming civically active. This is the way that we have to respond to these types of events. And this is a more wise approach that takes us from being a protest community to being a real civil rights and, more importantly, First Amendment community. Now, this video is getting a bit long, so I do have to wrap it up. But I want to conclude by saying that the American Muslim community is the preeminent and quintessential First Amendment community. Now, what does that mean? I've said this on this channel multiple times, but I haven't explained it. The First Amendment guarantees our right as Muslims in America to practice our faith. The Muslim community is the most diverse faith community in the world and in the United States. We have members of every political affiliation, members of every ethnic affiliation, members of every racial affiliation. So any part of a person's identity, there is someone from those identity groups that are in the American Muslim community. So because we are a faith community, our diversity prevents us from being an ethnic, from being a racial, or any other type of community. All of our rights are guaranteed under the First Amendment exclusively. Now, what does that mean? That means when we protect our rights, we strengthen the First Amendment. And what does that mean? That means when Muslims advocate for our rights, for free speech, for free association, for the right to petition the government, for the right to practice our religion. What that means is everybody else in the United States benefits from our activism. The other thing that's incredibly important here is we could literally be a bridge community because we have people in our community that are a part of every other community. So those people can be ambassadors. So they can be people who help merge our strategy on political empowerment with other community strategies. This is so important because unlike other communities, we are not a special interest. When we advocate for our rights, it benefits every American, no matter where they sit on the political spectrum. It benefits everyone because the First Amendment is the key to allowing Americans to have the type of life that we should be enjoying that the Trump administration is actively working to dismantle. So instead of being a community that is seen as only caring about our own issues, only benefiting, a foreign cause, or only looking out for ourselves, our community should be seen as a community that is active and attracts everyone else, because when we advance, everyone else benefits. That's what it means to be the quintessential First Amendment community. And if we can do that, then we can always win our fights, because the First Amendment is the law of the land. It is under attack, and it is what needs to be strengthened. We need to rise up to this moment, meet the moment, and become the defenders of the First Amendment, and then be the bridge community that brings everyone else into our activism. That leads to long-term empowerment. That leads to a better nation for everyone here. And that leads to the faith community having an actual place in empowerment and justice for everyone. Thank you for your time. I'll see you in the next episode.